Hi everybody, my name is Sabrina and I welcome you to my presentation of our paper Everyone for Themselves, a qualitative study about individual security setups of open source software contributors. Our study is motivated by the contrast between two types of developers. First, commercial proprietary software is typically written by company-employed developers. As such, their work environment can be very structured and regulated, and this includes security. They can receive more or less sensible policies as to how and when to change their passwords. Their soft and hardware may be managed, or there could be a ban on external hardware devices. Overall, they don't only receive security guidelines due to their contracts, they can also be penalized for failing to follow them. In contrast, open source developers are independent. They're often volunteers working on software in their precious free time, and they personally choose how they want to work on which project. This freedom has many benefits, leading to the creation of great and freely available software. But it also means that there are no authorities enforcing security practices and no consequences for lacking personal security. In the past years, the demand for open source software has continuously increased, in this example visualized by download requests per year. This increased reach and interest, however, also means that security issues within open source can become more critical due to their higher reach. This has been highlighted by code vulnerabilities such as Heartbleed, Shellshock, or Log4Shell, which affected millions of users. However, personal security choices can also affect a project's security. Our motivating example is the number of rising incidents based on weak credentials. When developers use weak passwords or choose not to use multi-factor authentication, their accounts become susceptible to account hijacking. In these attacks, malicious actors gain access to their repositories and can be able to inject backdoors or collect user data. Account takeovers and subsequent access abuse in recent incidents have also shown that high-profile projects such as Gentoo or ESLint can also be affected by weak authentication choices. With the background of account takeover attacks and the freedom within open source, we set out to interview open source developers on their individual security measures. In our interviews, we were interested in how they secured their accounts, systems, and devices, and how they handled sensitive data such as code secrets or private encryption keys. Furthermore, we were interested in the communication of security between developers. Are there any guidelines for contributors? How do project maintainers handle on or offboarding? In which ways do open source developers discuss security with each other? We created a 7-section interview guide to cover all these topics and to inquire about their personal experiences and sentiments. Overall, we aim to answer the following 3 research questions. First, we wanted to collect insights into which security measures open source developers deployed as part of their individual setups. Second, we were interested in challenges, both perceived by the participants regarding their own security and as identified by us during the interviews. Finally, based on the security status quo and observed challenges, we want to make recommendations on how to support open source contributors to increase their personal security while keeping the unique requirements and culture within open source in mind. Before conducting our interviews, we set some requirements for our participants. We first collected a list of GitHub repositories that were active, an expression that had a minimum of 40 commits by 20 unique contributors. We further wanted to interview developers of critical repositories. As criticality or popularity is very hard to define reliably for open source projects, we defined 2 different criteria. First, we sorted our list by the number of dependent projects, as we deemed this to have a high influence on the supply chain. For the second half of our interviews, we noticed that some critical repositories were not reflected by this approach, as they are widespread but rarely used as a dependency. We therefore resorted the list using a score based on the project stars and fork counts to gauge popularity. Overall, we only selected developers that had made at least 10 commits to the respective project, and that offered public contact information, allowing us to send them an email invite with our pre-survey and a link to our scheduling tool. As compensation, we offered them to sponsor a project of their choice with $60 for an estimated hour of their time. Overall, we conducted 20 semi-structured online interviews this way. With this background on our study setup, let's continue to our results. First, I want to present our findings about the security practices our participants deployed. Overall, our participants were highly security affine. They were aware of security measures and risks and typically deemed their setup to be very secure. Especially authentication-related measures, such as strong passwords, password managers, and multi-factor authentication, were utilized by a majority of participants. This type of measure was in general perceived as easy to use and to adopt, and as some kind of minimum effort they expected from each other. Beyond authentication, measures became less common. While many used encryption, or some kind of ad or tracker blocking techniques, already only half of our participants mentioned commit signing. A variety of other measures, such as firewalls, frequent software updates, or virtual machines in private networks, were only mentioned by at best a quarter of our participants. We assume that the reason for this decrease beyond authentication also stems from our participants' tech savviness. We found them to be highly pragmatic regarding their security choices. This included the avoidance of less usable toolings that were hard to set up or correctly configure, as P18 describes their experience with email encryption. Similarly, we found that about half of our participants relied on operating system encryption defaults, sometimes remarking its ease of use instead of manually configuring encryption. In other cases, we found that participants rejected security measures they perceived as less relevant or unnecessary. This was especially noticeable when they described their physical setup, for example, whether they used locks or special storages to secure devices. These measures were perceived as not necessary at best, as their homes and travel behavior was secure enough for their daily life. Otherwise, physical security was described as futile from the start, especially when assuming a worst-case scenario of a dedicated attacker who is using violence to receive access to their devices and accounts. While developers were overall security affine, we also identified some challenges that affected how individual security was handled or discussed. First of all, we found that security was rarely communicated between project contributors. For example, in an initial exploration, we found not a single set of official guidelines for personal security measures within the 100 repositories with the highest number of dependents. In our interviews, participants confirmed that they had never encountered any type of official security guideline within their open source work. This lack of guidelines also affected onboarding. Typically, our participants never received any information on best security practices or expected measures they should adopt when they joined new projects. The only exception to this were participants who were able to work on open source projects during their paid company work, as in these cases, often company internal policies applied. Finally, we also learned that our participants' security setups were typically based on their individual decisions, not on their interactions with others. We only rarely heard that they discussed security and talked about topics such as expected measures or best practices, configuration details, or new developments based on recent research, emerging new technologies, or security incidents. However, we did not only find challenges within their communication of security practices. Another major theme throughout our interviews was the huge influence of social factors on the security behavior and interactions between developers, which might also explain the lacking communication previously mentioned. For example, we found that politeness or respect for each other was very important. Participants did not want to ask others about their security and whether they deployed special measures, as they did not want to affront them or suggest that they did not trust them. We further found that inactive developers commonly retained their access rights as a form of respect for their past work. In the same vein, a couple of participants also voiced concerns to be perceived as annoying or weird if they talked too much about security. Hence, they restricted themselves and focused on their personal security instead of exchanging suggestions and ideas. Most importantly, we found that trust is an important factor. As basic security practices were regarded as common sense, participants trusted that technically skilled contributors must also have good security hygiene, and expressed that they would be surprised to learn if the security of others was lacking. This led to a different challenge, more directly related to the specific circumstances of open source projects, which was how the important factor of trust was handled in practice. While we knew that the open source ecosystem is a welcoming space that allows people from any background to take part in development, we were surprised that several participants told us anecdotes about receiving project access basically overnight, in a way that even surprised themselves. Based on these experiences, we assume that this is partially based on desperation. If a solitary main project lead burns out and needs a stand in to keep the project running, they might select whoever feels most suitable, or who they trust just based on their previous commit history. The recent XZ utils backdoor has demonstrated this effect in practice, as the attacker had worked on benign commits for almost 2 years before beginning to add the backdoor. A further consequence of this combination of burned out project owners, trust based on technical skills, and a high influence of social factors such as respect was that we found that project members were only rarely properly offboarded or removed from projects when they became inactive. This was partially because participants stressed that in open source, there is rarely a clear point in time that marks the end of one's contributions, and people tend to appear again after a while. This makes it hard for maintainers to notice who is truly inactive, or to feel like restricting somebody's access rights is appropriate. Overall, we found some underlying challenges that seemed hard to solve while upholding the basic principles of open source. Due to the way open source software projects are structured, and due to how contributors interact with each other, it is hard to enforce security, or to even check whether developers applied certain measures. This also pertains to background checks or similar. Typically, contributors are judged based on their technical contributions in practice or in previous projects. In some cases, they might have some reputation, and other contributors vouch for them. But the smaller a project is, the less practical or feasible it becomes to conduct background checks. Additionally, the more requirements projects impose on their future contributors, the more they exclude individuals that are, for example, not willing to share information due to privacy concerns. Overall, this would go against the base principle of allowing any skilled individual to become part of open source. Finally, even if maintainers would be willing to check backgrounds and enforce security, they are typically only volunteers and have a limited number of time and resources. Therefore, they are often unable to conduct these measures. Based on our various observations regarding the individual security measures and practices of open source developers and their surrounding challenges, we make some recommendations to improve overall security without impacting the unique culture of trust and respect too much. First, we noticed that participants did not feel comfortable about addressing each other's security choices or even demanding security. However, we deem measures such as multi-factor authentication and strong passwords among the most relevant measures, especially with regard to recent incidents that were possible due to weak authentication on developer accounts. Therefore, we suggest moving the responsibilities away from contributors and towards relevant service providers. Our interviews suggest that while demanding security was perceived as rude or inappropriate, contributors did not harbor these feelings towards platforms such as GitHub or NPM. Therefore, they were much more accepted when platforms or project settings enforced additional factors. In this sense, awkward social situations can be avoided, while at the same time, account security is increased. And apparently, we are not the only ones who noticed this, as for example, both GitHub and PyPy announced to enforce multi-factor authentication for all accounts within the last year. Secondly, while single points of failure are typically to be avoided, we deem the definition of a clear maintainer hierarchy and the restriction of access to publishing rights or code secrets to be desirable within open source. In some interviews, participants reported that they reduced who has access to a point where only singular dedicated admins were able to access API keys that every developer might need. In consequence, the remaining accounts require a less strict security setup. Additionally, a less liberal distribution of rights, for example, by limiting how easily new users can gain commit access, can partially mitigate some risks of social engineering attacks. As a final improvement suggestion, We think that open source could benefit from the creation of a basic guidance template. While almost every project we found had some guidance on how to report vulnerabilities, there was almost no security guidance for the developers themselves. We believe that the creation of a simple and easily copy and pastable template is necessary, with advice that is low barrier for any developers to keep the project inclusive and that is easy to copy to new projects, to provide both a sense for minimum security requirements and a helpful hand on how to implement them. Thank you for listening to my talk. This was only a portion of our findings, highlighting the most prominent themes throughout our interviews. If you are interested in more details, please check out our website and paper, or reach out to me via email.